there are some basic techniques to help you get ahead of the weeds. And I'm going to go forward with some of those. Now, as you think about it, weeds are basically your farm enemies. And as you think about weeds, it's really a plant, kind of the basic definition is a plant in the wrong place. And the reason we say that is because, you know, some plants you like your Kentucky bluegrass in your lawn. But as soon as it moves into your flower beds, all of a sudden it becomes a weed. So sometimes weeds are just plants in the wrong place. But a lot of the weeds also have a competitive advantage. And sometimes this is their seed viability. So how well they reproduce very rapidly with a lot of seeds. And some of these seeds can lay dormant for many years and still come up and give us problems. And most of these weeds disperse their seeds very easily and readily. As you notice when you go out and watch your dandelions, they go up, bloom, form a seed head, and they blow throughout your whole neighborhood in not very many days. So they disperse very rapidly and easily. And the other thing a lot of these weeds have is they don't have a lot of enemies. Many of our weeds came from another continent. And when the weed seed came to this continent, the insects and diseases that attack that weed did not come with it. So now these weeds have an environment where nothing really eats them or makes them sick, and so they really thrive. And that's a problem with a lot of our weeds. They're finding insects and diseases from the old countries where they came from, and they're trying to research and bring them, called biological control agents, that they do a lot of research and bring them. So that is a possibility of controlling weeds as well. Now, many of you have a farm or a backyard or a garden that you're trying to control weeds on. And if we start thinking like an army general, and your enemy is the weeds, you start thinking of, what is the first thing I will do as the army general of my area to combat these weeds? And if you think about it, most army generals, the first thing they're going to do is gain or gather intelligence. They want to know what their weed is, what they're fighting against. And so as you start to gain intelligence about your enemy, the weeds, you start to learn what type of weed they are, because this is going to help you control them. So first you got to identify it. What is it? There are herbaceous weeds. There are woody weeds. And a lot of it comes down to the shape and color of their flower and their leaves. So as you start looking at the shape of the flower, how many petals it has on it, the color and the shape of the weeds, you can start to narrow down what type of plant that is. Some are annual weeds, some are perennial, and some are biannual. Many of you may know annual, it produced from seed this year. It comes up, lives its life, produces another seed, and dies. It does not come back year after year. Perennial are weeds that are coming back year after year. They mentioned earlier about field bindweed. That is a perennial. It's going to keep coming back from that same root source year after year. And then we have some interesting ones called biannuals, where they will come up in a leaf area first, but they don't go to seed that first year. And then the next year they will bolt and go to seed. So they're kind of a 2-year type plant. Then there are grasses and broadleaves. If you can identify that, that helps you learn how to kill them. And then many of our weeds have different modes of reproduction, how they spread. Many are through seeds, I'm going to show you some through roots and rhizomes that they actually are creeping type of weeds that give us a lot of trouble and are some of the hardest to control. I'll show you a few of those. And then vegetative, sometimes it just needs a piece of the plant and it can grow. So there's lots of ways, but as soon as you start gaining this knowledge and understanding of these weeds, it will help you combat them. I'm going to go through just some brief weeds just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. This weed is called Burr Buttercup. And as you notice, it's a small plant and it comes up very early in the year. And even the leaves aren't really leaves. They are just kind of these stem-like protrusions, but and when it comes up, flowers, and then goes to seed, it forms this hard burr. Many of you may know it. You sit down or put your hand on the ground and that burr sticks into you. It's a coarse seed head. This is an annual. Once we realize it's an annual, two things we should know: that it's going to have a short root system. So tillage is something that can work really well with some of our annuals because you can till them out. They have short root system and we want to get rid of them before they go to seed. So that's one annual, just to kind of give you an example. Here's another annual, Puncture Vine. Many people call it goat head. You see these little very sharp seed heads will puncture your bike tires and will cure you from wanting to walk barefoot. Yeah, they hurt quite a bit. You see it has a similar flower. It's a yellow flower with small petals, but look at the leaf. The leaf is a lot different and the seed head is quite different from the Burr Buttercup that we viewed before. So as you can see, these plants are quite different, but they're both annuals and shallow root system, easy to till and take out of. And I'll talk a little more about some of our annuals we can use what we call a pre-emergent on. This is foxtail barley. It is actually a perennial. And so it's coming year after year and it forms a seed head that breaks off and gets into your socks and spreads, gets into animals, fur coats, and spreads all over. A little more difficult to control than just your annuals. Burdock is another common weed you'll see, huge leaf, and forms these stickers that get onto you and get into your horse's mane or your cow's tail and causes a lot of irritation, but also is easily spread through that. This is a biannual, so it's going to come up in a rosette at first, 1 year, and then the next year it'll bolt and form the seed head. Now this is Hori Cress, and as you notice, this plant has a white flower and it has this, and I'm showing you this long root system that goes laterally in the ground and sends up new shoots. So this is what we call a rhizome. A rhizome is basically an underground stem that continues to grow outward from this plant and will send up new plants. And so it slowly takes over an area. And the hard part about this is not like your annuals, because if you till this, every time you break that root, it starts a new plant. So chopping up that root actually spreads it. So this is not one you'd want to try to control with just a one-time tillage as you would an annual. Here's a picture of this white top, and it can take over vast areas in a short amount of time. And so staying on top of this type of weed is very important. It's generally considered a noxious weed that needs to be controlled right away. Um, here's another weed that is rhizominous or has rhizomes. It's quackgrass. Quackgrass is a grass that you'll see come in. It's a little thicker bladed, sometimes in your lawn. It'll come in a little thicker bladed, and you see those patches start to grow and move outward. The same concept is every time you till this or cut this rhizome, it will send up these new plants. And so this is one that takes a more concerted effort to kill, just like the white top. It's a perennial. It's going to come back year after year. Field bindweed is another one of our deep-rooted perennial plants that has a very deep root system and rhizominous root system that's going to spread and take over vast areas. Very difficult to control this with just tillage practices. As you start to learn this, I hope that helps, because sometimes we need to get a little more aggressive with these type of plants. Russian knapweed is another rhizominous and spreading plant. It's a perennial noxious weed. And the other one I would say is this Canada thistle. We have three main thistles that we battle. One is this Canada thistle on our left, and that has a rhizominous root system. The one in the middle, which is Scotch thistle, and the one on the right is our musk thistle. Those are biannuals. So learning that, you can realize you've got 2 years, or at least a year, on the rosette system to get rid of them before they bolt and go to seed. But as you see, if you let them bolt and go to seed, their seed heads become very numerous, many seeds produced, and they're kind of like your dandelion. Once the wind blows, they scatter seeds all over and reinfest new areas. This kochia is a summer annual. So it comes up in the heat of the summer and grows very quickly and can take over areas with low amount of moisture. You'll see this one coming in quite a bit, but a tillage, because it's an annual or a pre-emergent, is a little easier on this. Another one in that same category would be red root pigweed. This plant is a summer annual and grows really rapidly in our gardens and lawn areas, and can be controlled early with tillage, but once it gets a deep root system, need to be a little more aggressive with that one. Okay, so this is just some basics about weeds and the differences between weeds. So now we've gained our intelligence, we're learning about these weeds, and we know what they are. Now we go to phase 2 of weed control. And I would say phase 2 is prevention. It's much easier to prevent plants from coming in than to control them. So prevention, you're looking at cleaning equipment that is coming onto your place, making sure that if someone's using a piece of equipment somewhere else, that it's cleaned before it's brought onto your property. Many of our noxious weeds can be transmitted just through equipment. Also, when you're buying seed, make sure that it's weed-free seed. There's some plants certified weed-free seed that you can buy, and make sure you're not bringing something in from unclean weed source, or seed source, I should say. And then another item is to keep weeds and weed seeds out. A lot of weed and weed seeds are brought in either by hay, straw, sometimes even topsoil and manure. So know your source. When you're bringing some of that in for soil amendments, you'll want to make sure that it's coming from a weed-free area. I've seen many times where a heap of manure, such as horse manure. They pile it up and compost it a little bit, but a lot of times they don't. They just let it sit for a time, and all of a sudden you get a lot of weeds growing up in that and weed seeds. And then you go pick that manure up with all this weed and weed seeds and bring it into your garden. You just brought in a whole bunch of weed problems. If you can compost that manure, turn it and get it the right temperature and moisture, a lot of those weed seeds can become unviable. So they basically deteriorate if you compost manure really well. But if not, it can bring in a lot of weed seeds. Yeah, in topsoil too, you know, if the topsoil has white top or some of the quackgrass with those rhizomes, and you dig that up and bring it into your garden, that can bring a source of a very noxious weed into your garden. So you got to be careful with what you're bringing in. Make sure you know the source and that it's not bringing anything, any bad weeds in. And then prevent weeds going to seed as much as you can. A mower can do a lot for you. If you see the weeds getting a little ahead of you, you couldn't get to them to kill them or take care of them, make sure you trim them back before they go to seed and before their seed develops. Okay, now we go to phase 2. So we're keeping everything out. We're keeping this weed seeds down. Phase 2 is a lot of cultural practices is what we call. Mainly taking care of the plants you do have, the ones you do want to grow in your landscape and in your garden. And that's keeping healthy plants, good fertility, good crop varieties, you know, that grow well. Sick and crops that don't grow well allow a lot of weed seeds in. And the other thing, planting your plants as close together that they won't outcompete each other, but as close together as you can to reduce the amount of opening for weeds to come in. All weeds need are fertilizer, an opening, some sunlight, and a little water. So if we can eliminate those openings for these weeds, we can reduce a lot of our weed pressure. So getting plants a little closer together, changing our irrigation so that we're only watering the plants that we desire instead of all the area in between. So going to a drip irrigation system can really reduce a lot of your weed pressure because you're not watering all the space in between your plants. You're only watering that plant. Crop rotation. So rotating out of one crop and into another regularly will break up some of those weed cycles. And then making sure you have good insect and disease control on your garden plants and landscape plants, because a dying tree or a dying plant opens up a lot of space for weeds to come in. And another thing that is really getting more popular and I think very helpful is doing cover crops. A cover crop is a group of plants you're using to take the space between your crop that you're currently having and the crop you're going to grow next. So these crops can really, cover crops fill in that gap. So you don't have a fallow garden allowing a lot of weed seeds and weeds to develop. Instead, you're putting in a cover crop, something you want that will put in a little nitrogen fertilizer, some of your legumes, or capture a lot of the leftover nutrients in that area. And when you're ready to go back into the crop you want, you till that in and plant your current crop or cash crop that you want in there. So cover crops have become very popular and very beneficial for soil health and keeping weeds out of your crops and garden area. So those are that was phase 2. Now we're going to go to phase 3. And phase 3 is mechanical or physical techniques. So this is the hard work part of it. The hand pulling or hoeing, cultivating. You can use cultivation, plowing, discs, mowing, digging. And then a lot of us can use a bit of mulch, putting on a cover of organic matter or a weed barrier on top of the soil to prevent a lot of the weeds from getting started. Some of the mulches, you can use straw, wood chips, gravel, and some plastic mulches. And then there are techniques of flaming the weeds using a propane burner. But I'd caution you about that, especially in dry summertime when there's a lot of dry weeds and plants and a little wind. I know an individual that just about burnt his neighbor's house down doing that. So I would caution you against getting too aggressive on that. But early in the spring, when it's still moist and wet and you can burn the cuticle off of those plants and dry them out, flaming can be an option. And then phase 4 on your weed control phases would be biological control. And biological control is basically using another living organism to combat your weeds. And there are insects that actually eat certain weeds. With musk thistle, there is a weevil that they brought in that will actually eat the seeds off of the seed heads. And it's proven to be very beneficial in many areas to control some of our musk thistle issues. And then there are also diseases that we can actually bring in to control some of our noxious weeds. They've been working on a powder mildew for field bindweed that actually is proving to do quite well, that you can actually transport from one plant to another and help reduce the weed issues with field bindweed. So there are developing more and more insects and diseases you can use to combat some of our weeds. Chickens have been used quite a bit they'll eat a lot of the weed seeds and scratch around a bit and control some of our weeds. You got to be careful because they do like some of our good plants too. And so but in a fallow time, after you pull your plants out, like in this picture, they put electric fence around the garden area and allow the chickens to go in there and clean up some of the weeds and insect issues they're having. And then goat and sheep. Goats and sheep can do very well at controlling some of our weeds that we have. Again, it's nice to have an electric mesh fence or some way to control them so they don't eat everything. You can guide them to the spots that you need help controlling some of your plants that are getting ahead of you. And I'd say the last phase, which is phase 5, we consider our chemical phase. I put this as last because we don't like to use this right off the bat. We want to make sure we're doing everything else, kind of an integrative pest management program, before we resort to chemicals. But there again, we do occasionally need to use chemicals to control some of these plants. And I've kind of separated them into a couple options. There's the organic option that many want to use. They're just not as harsh in the environment and degrade quite rapidly and are a good option, especially early on when plants are small. Once they get mature, it's really tough to kill them. Some of the organic methods are vinegar, clove extracts, some citric acid and acetic acid. You can go in your yard and garden centers and find some organic options for weed control. Problem is, again, as in mature weeds and perennial weeds, they don't really help a lot. It's hard to get those, like the rhizominous ones I talked to you about. The non-organic methods, there's some restricted and non-restricted use chemicals. That basically means that you have to have a license on a restricted pesticide to be able to purchase that and use that. And the reason is because it's a little more could be more environmentally damaging. And so you have to have proper knowledge and understanding before you can use it to make sure you are protected and the environment's protected. The non-restricted weed control options are whatever's over the counter that you can get at your local garden center or hardware store. And you start looking at these chemicals, there are some that are non-selective. And one that would fall under that category is Roundup. Roundup is not selective. It's going to kill most anything that's green, except for some of those major weeds that you have, and it will kill most green plants. And so I think that's why that's most widely used as a Roundup option, is because it can kill a lot of different types of plants. It's not selective, and you need to be careful where you're spraying that, because if you're spraying dandelions in your lawn, it's going to kill your lawn right along with the dandelions. A broadleaf weed killer is like your dandelion killers. They have usually a 2,4-D type product in them, and they are designed to get any plant that's not a grass. So many of your plants that have a little a broadleaf, it will control, and that's where you're getting them for your lawns to control your broadleaf weeds in your grasses, and it's widely used in that setting. And then there's the products you call Pre-Emergence, and these are basically a chemical barrier that prevents new seedlings from coming up. Team is one of the common ones you'll see out there. That product you would not use in a garden area where you're planting your garden from seed, because it would prevent those from coming up. But a lot of times in your perennial beds, that Team is a good option, especially if you've got a lot of annual plants coming up in that flower bed or area. It lasts a bit, quite a long time, and if you add that pre-emergent with a weed barrier or a weed cloth, that can be very effective. And then mulch on top of that, you add these weed control products, pretty soon you have a pretty good weed barrier. I would caution you with, there are some products out there that are soil sterilants that are used a bit in rock areas where they don't want anything to grow. But I would caution you about those, that they last a very long time and they do leach and move from that area into trees, into shrubs, and can kill a lot of plants. And if you're going to use any of those, make sure it doesn't have a chance of moving to some of your plants. I get called out as an extension agent to help people diagnose what's wrong with their tree. And I will say a lot of times that soil sterilant has caused a lot of damage to trees, especially next to roadways where they've used it, or next to a rock garden where they want to control the weeds there, but the rain has come down and moved that over to the adjacent trees or shrubbery and has killed them. So just a caution about soil sterilants. Make sure you know what you're doing when you're using those. Now I'm just going to show you some pictures of some farms and some homesteads and just kind of discuss what you see there. This is a picture of a farm that I visited, and there are some raised beds here. They're kind of hard to see. and here, and I think he's got broccoli growing there. And I would just say, how is he doing with weed control? He was an organic person, didn't want to use much. And as I can see, well, he's not doing too well at his weed control. If you look at it, he's got a lot of weeds and weed seeds coming about. His plants are not planted very close together, so there's a lot of space in between that they are growing. He put a little mulch in there, but definitely not enough to keep some of these weeds out. And so this is an area I would say, yeah, he's failing at his weed control in all phases, and they're getting ahead of him. Let's look at another farm. This is another U-pick flower operation. What we see here is they've got some rows. They're not planted real close together, but they're fairly good. It looks like they've been hoeing a little bit, so they're using mechanical control. And that's about it. Some of the weeds are really getting ahead of them on this farm, so they could use some of these weed techniques to take care of this. Here's a farm where they've got drip irrigation, so that's helpful. It's only going to water your planting areas and leave the inner place more dry. They've got a plastic mulch that they're using to control weeds. You can see under these planting beds that. Still, they've got a lot of weeds coming in. But they're starting to work towards improving their garden weed control. Here's a farm that you can see they've got a lot of plants. They're planted pretty close together. It looks like they're using cultivation. So they must have a cultivator that they can run through. You can see they've cultivated this and ripped a lot of those small plants out. And looks like they've got in between beds that they can rip them out with cultivation. The weeds are knocked back, not going to seed at this point. So this farm's doing pretty good. Here's a strawberry farm, and you can see that they're using quite a bit of cultivation to get the weeds in between their plants. And look how close their plants are planted together, so the weeds aren't growing up in between there very well right now. So I would say they're doing a pretty good job. They're tilling on top of the rows as well. Could use a little weed control around their risers, but they're staying ahead of their weeds quite well on this farm. Here's another flower operation, and I like this operation because they are doing a lot right. They've got a really good plastic mulch that they've put down where they're planting into that plastic mulch very tightly, so there's not a lot of weeds. Actually, there's no weeds coming up on these rows. Pretty impressive. Then they do a cover crop in between, or a row cover, with live plants. So they've got grass that they planted in here that's helping keep the weeds down. They're able to mow that and keep most of their weeds from going to seed and out competing the weeds in the rows in between. They've got drip irrigation run underneath these row covers, and you go to this garden, you can tell they've thought about their weed control and they're staying ahead of those weeds really well. And this is another one. So this is a weed barrier. So they're putting a weed barrier down, and they are doing potted plants on top of that. That's one way to keep the weeds down. And you can see they've got a drip system run to each one of these plants, so they're not watering the whole area, encouraging a lot of weeds and weed seeds to come up. This is a hoop house where you can see they're pretty aggressive at taking care of their weeds. They have a really thick plastic mulch that they're putting down to keep the weeds out, and they're planting right into that very tightly. And they have Uh, Under this is a drip irrigation system. So you can see the weeds are starting to build up along the side where the mulch is not there. But for the most part, this is a very weed-free environment, and the plants are growing quite well in a hoop house situation. And some people elect to grow above the ground to get away from the weeds. And this is a tire garden. The individual planted all of their produce in these tires, and just walking and not irrigating in between has made a very dense, packed ground that is covering and not allowing a lot of weeds in there for compaction as well as water not getting to those